The little town sat in the valley like a patchwork quilt, stitched together by dirt roads, wooden storefronts, and the constant chatter of folks who seemed to know more about each other's business than they did their own. Among them lived a young woman named Clara May, whose presence was as quiet as the dawn yet carried a strength most overlooked. Clara was poor, so poor, in fact, that every step she took through town felt like it echoed against her patched skirts, her scuffed boots, and her second-hand shawl. But her spirit was not broken. Clara's life revolved around survival, but she did it with grace. Each morning before the sun rose, she was awake, her hands raw from scrubbing, her fingers pricked from sewing. She mended clothes for neighbors, churned butter for a widow down the road, and occasionally worked at the town laundry, though the pay barely covered bread and flour. Every coin she earned went toward feeding her younger siblings, 2 boys with hungry bellies, and dreams far too big for their tiny cabin, and buying medicine for her father, who had been bedridden ever since a logging accident left him too weak to work. The house they lived in leaned slightly to the east, its roof patched with tin, its door rattling in the wind. Inside, though, it was tidy, because Clara would not allow despair to rule them. She swept the dirt floor every day, mended her brother's worn shirts, and kept her father's bed fresh with clean linens. If she was mocked in town, she held her chin high at home, for she knew her siblings looked to her not just for bread, but for courage, yet the mockery was relentless. When Clara walked to the market with her basket of mended handkerchiefs or loaves of coarse bread she had baked, the town women would whisper loud enough for her to hear. "There goes the beggar girl," one would say, eyes lingering on the patches covering Clara's sleeves. Another would laugh behind a lace-gloved hand. "She thinks anyone would want her to teach them manners, looking like that?" Even the young men were unkind. Some would tip their hats mockingly, calling her Miss Fancy, as though her poverty was some grand joke. Clara never lashed back. She simply tightened her grip on her basket and moved along, though her cheeks burned with humiliation. She had long ago learned that answering back only gave them more to gossip about. Instead, she let their words slide off her like rain on a tin roof, at least outwardly. Inside, each remark was a sting she buried deep, promising herself she would never let her siblings hear of the cruelty. What no one noticed was that Clara's eyes, though shadowed by weariness, still held a light in them. She had dreams she dared not speak aloud, dreams of someday owning a piece of land where her brothers could run free, where she might plant a garden without worrying about someone pulling her up short for the rent she owed. She dreamed of dignity, of a life where she was not measured by the thinness of her dress or the shabbiness of her shoes, but by the content of her heart. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of dawn when she kneaded bread at the rough wooden table, she whispered prayers under her breath. She prayed not for riches, but for strength. Not for grand dresses, but for health for her father, food for her brothers, and courage for herself to face another day of stares and laughter. The town, blind to her resilience, saw only the surface. They did not see the nights she stayed up mending clothes by candlelight so her brothers could attend school looking decent. They did not see her skipping meals so her father might have an extra portion of stew. They did not see the calluses on her hands, earned from carrying buckets of water a mile from the creek when their barrel ran dry. To them, she was merely that poor girl. But in truth, Clara was far more than that. She was a quiet warrior, a protector, and a dreamer whose heart had been tempered by hardship. Though she had little, she gave much. Though mocked, she refused to bow her head in shame. And while the rest of the town laughed, somewhere deep within her, Clara felt that life had something waiting for her, something greater than all the cruel words combined. For now, though her world was one of patched skirts, worn boots, and whispered gossip, and though she bore it silently, fate was already at work, setting into motion a chain of events that would soon carry Clara far beyond the limits of her humble cabin and the cruel eyes of the townspeople. The annual town fair was the highlight of the year in that little frontier settlement, a day when every man, woman, and child set aside their usual burdens to gather in the square. Brightly colored banners fluttered from poles. The air filled with the scent of roasted corn, fried dough, and sweet apple cider. Farmers brought their best livestock to show off. Women entered pies into contests, and fiddlers played lively tunes while children darted between booths. It was a celebration of prosperity, or at least the appearance of it. For Clara May, it was a chance, not for revelry, but for survival. She had spent weeks preparing for the fair, stitching handkerchiefs, aprons, and small embroidered cloths in the dim light of her cabin. She knew if she could sell enough, she might buy enough flour, beans, and salt pork to carry her family through the next 2 months. With her basket carefully lined and stacked with her handiwork, she dressed in her neatest patched dress, smoothed her hair into a tidy braid, and set out with hope stitched as tightly into her heart as the threads on her cloths. The fairgrounds bustled as she arrived. Merchants shouted out prices, children squealed with delight at candy stands, and women in fine bonnets paraded about, flaunting their silks and lace. Clara found a small corner near a stall selling horseshoes, her basket placed carefully on the ground before her. She arranged her work with trembling hands, whispering to herself that surely someone would see the worth in them. Even if she herself was poor dot at first, no one stopped. They glanced, sometimes wrinkling their noses as though poverty itself clung to the fabric she offered. Then came a group of women wives of the wealthier ranchers who paused nearby. One of them, a tall woman in a dress of blue satin, picked up one of Clara's embroidered handkerchiefs, turning it over as though it were some curiosity. "Well," the woman drawled, loud enough for others to hear, "isn't this quaint? Hand-sewn, I suppose? Must have taken her all winter just to stitch these crooked flowers." The others laughed. Their voices sharp as needles. Another woman, her fingers heavy with rings, sniffed. "I wouldn't blow my nose on such fabric." Imagine the shame of carrying something made by her. Her eyes flicked toward Clara, a sneer curling her lips. Clara's cheeks flamed, but she held her tongue. She wanted to tell them the flowers were not crooked, that each stitch was made with care and precision by lamplight, but words caught in her throat. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap, reminding herself she was there for her family, not for pride. The women weren't finished. One leaned closer, pretending to whisper though her voice carried. Who in their right mind would marry a girl with nothing but rags to her name? Can't cook her way into a husband's house, can't charm her way into town society. Perhaps she should just sew handkerchiefs forever. Their laughter rose again, drawing the attention of nearby men. Some joined in, chuckling, and one called out with a smirk, "Maybe she'll catch herself a husband if she throws in a free apron." The laughter echoed in Clara's ears, each word a stone pressing down on her spirit. She lowered her gaze, fingers gripping her skirt to keep them from trembling. It wasn't the first time she'd been mocked, but somehow, in the bustle of the fair with everyone watching, it stung sharper than usual. She felt the eyes of the town upon her, weighing her worth, finding it lacking. Still, Clara endured. When the women finally tossed the handkerchief back into her basket and strutted away, she lifted her chin and smoothed the fabric with steady hands. She refused to let tears fall, not here, not where they would take it as victory. She sat in silence, the sound of laughter and fiddle music swirling around her like a cruel reminder of everything she did not have. A few sympathetic souls passed by an older farmer's wife who gave her a kind smile, a child who marveled at her embroidery before being pulled away by his mother. But no one bought a thing. By noon, her basket was as full as when she had arrived, though her heart was emptier. When the contests began, pies lined up for judging, livestock shone off in proud circles. Clara packed her basket slowly, every motion heavy with disappointment. She had dreamed of returning home with coins enough to buy flour and sugar, of telling her brothers they'd eat well for weeks. Instead, she would walk back with nothing but the cruel words of others ringing in her ears. Still, as she rose to leave, she whispered to herself the same promise she always did. For them, I'll keep trying. Her father's weak smile and her brother's hungry eyes gave her strength no fairground insult could destroy. And though she turned from the laughter of the crowd with her head bowed low, fate was watching. Someone had noticed. Hidden among the crowd was a man few dared to mock, a man whose wealth and power stretched farther than the eye could see across rolling fields of cattle and endless horizons. The rich baron had watched it all unfold, his gaze lingering not on the cruelty of the crowd, but on the dignity with which Clara endured. And in that moment, a seed of something unexpected began to take root in his heart. The sun dipped lower that evening, casting a golden haze across the fairgrounds as laughter and chatter carried into the air. Clara May lingered near the edge of the square, clutching her unsold basket of hand-sewn goods. She tried to keep her head high, but the sting of the day clung to her like burrs on a hem. Every laugh she had endured still rang in her ears, each mocking glance a shadow on her heart. She was preparing to leave when she felt a presence nearby, a stillness in the crowd that seemed to part without words. Slowly she lifted her eyes and saw him, the Baron. Even those who did not know him by name knew him by reputation. Elias Blackwood was a man of immense wealth and quiet power, owner of the largest ranch in 3 counties. His cattle roamed farther than most men ever traveled. His horses were prized across the territory, and his word could sway an entire town council. Yet for all his riches, he was a man wrapped in mystery. He rarely attended such gatherings, and when he did, he kept to himself. Many whispered about his solitary ways, some saying loss had hardened him, others that wealth had made him cold. But when Clara's gaze met his, she saw something entirely different. His eyes, dark as the stormy horizon, were not filled with arrogance or scorn, but with quiet observation and intensity that made her catch her breath. He had been watching. She realized, with a shiver of surprise, that he had seen everything. Elias stood tall, his broad shoulders wrapped in a fine coat that marked him as a man above the rest. But there was nothing boastful in his stance. Instead, there was stillness, a calm that seemed to silence the noise of the fair. He stepped closer, boots crunching over the dusty ground, and the crowd, sensing his presence, gave him room. Conversations hushed, eyes turned, and yet his focus never wavered from Clara. "You stitched those yourself?" His voice was low, smooth, carrying an authority that made even the most prideful men take notice. Clara blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, sir," she answered softly, her hands tightening around the basket. She expected mockery, some veiled remark about her poverty, but his expression remained unreadable. He reached into the basket and picked up one of the embroidered handkerchiefs, holding it between his calloused fingers. The delicate flowers stitched in neat, careful patterns looked fragile against his large hand. He studied it for a long moment before looking back at her. "Fine work. Strong stitching. These'll last longer than anything shipped in from the city." Clara's lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her face. Praise was rarer still from a man of his standing. She swallowed, her voice trembling. "Thank you, sir. I do my best." Elias gave a slight nod, as though confirming what he already knew. And yet, not a soul here saw the worth in them. His gaze flicked briefly toward the crowd, many of whom had begun whispering among themselves at the sight of the Baron speaking to the poor girl they had scorned only hours before. His eyes narrowed not in anger, but in quiet disapproval, and several of the gossiping women shifted uneasily under his glance. Clara felt her cheeks heat. She wanted to disappear under that scrutiny, yet at the same time, something in his words stirred within her a small flame of pride. It was as if, for the first time, someone truly saw her. "I'll take these." Elias placed the handkerchiefs back in the basket, his tone final, not a question but a declaration. He reached into his coat and handed her more coins than the entire basket was worth. Her breath caught. This was enough for flour, sugar, even meat for weeks. She stared at the silver in her palm, unable to speak. "I don't." She shook her head, flustered. "This is too much." "It's fair," he replied simply. "Your work is worth it." The words struck deeper than the coins themselves. Worth it. No one had ever said that to her, not about her work, not about her life. Her throat tightened, and she nodded mutely, unable to trust her voice. Before she could gather her thoughts, Elias tipped his hat slightly and turned to leave, his tall frame cutting through the crowd with ease. Yet as he walked away, he paused and looked back once more, his eyes meeting hers with a flicker of something unspoken curiosity, perhaps, or recognition. Then he was gone, swallowed by the sea of people. Clara stood rooted to the spot, the weight of the coins pressing into her palm, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. She had come to the fair expecting ridicule, and she had found plenty of it. But in the midst of it all, the richest man in the county had seen her, not as the poor girl everyone mocked, but as someone of value. And though she didn't know it yet, that single exchange was the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. The days following the fair passed in a blur for Clara May. She could hardly believe what had happened, that the Baron, Elias Blackwood himself, had spoken to her, bought her hand-sewn work, and given her more than fair payment. Each time she counted the coins, her hands trembled, not only because of their value, but because of the memory of his words, "Your work is worth it." That phrase echoed in her mind, steadying her when doubts threatened to drag her under. Her brothers noticed the change immediately. Supper was heartier, with cornbread and beans on the table instead of only thin broth. Their father, pale and weak in his bed, asked quietly how she had managed it, and Clara smiled, brushing his question away with, "A bit of luck at the fair." She could not bring herself to explain. Some part of her feared the moment had been a dream, one that would dissolve if spoken aloud, but the dream had only just begun. One afternoon, as Clara returned from the creek with a heavy pail of water, the sound of hoofbeats approached. Her heart skipped when she looked up and saw a tall figure on horseback trotting toward her cabin. The rider was unmistakable. Elias Blackwood's dark coat and broad hat caught the late sun, and his proud stallion gleamed as if it had been brushed that morning by skilled hands. Clara froze, the pail swinging heavily at her side, unsure whether to run inside or stand her ground. When he dismounted, the quiet of the land seemed to grow heavier, as though the air itself held its breath. Elias tied his horse to the fence and walked toward her, each step measured, his boots crunching softly against the dry earth. Clara's brothers peered from the doorway, eyes wide, whispering in hushed voices. "Miss Clara?" Elias greeted with a polite nod. His voice was steady, as though he had spoken her name 100 times before. Clara's throat tightened. "Mr. Blackwood," she managed, bowing her head. I didn't expect you." "I imagine not," he said with a faint curve of his lips, almost a smile. He glanced toward the cabin, his eyes catching on the sagging roof, the weathered boards, the smoke curling weakly from the chimney. There was no pity in his gaze, only consideration, as if he were studying something worth knowing. Clara shifted nervously. "If you came for your coins back, sir, I'll return them." "I never meant to take more than—" Elias lifted a hand, cutting her off gently. "I came for no such thing. The coins were honest payment. I came because I saw something at that fair, something that stuck with me." Her brow furrowed in confusion, but before she could speak, he continued. "I've wealth enough to buy half this valley," he said plainly, his tone not boastful but matter-of-fact. "But I've learned wealth buys cattle, land, men's loyalty. It doesn't buy peace. It doesn't buy honesty. And it surely doesn't buy the kind of strength I saw in you, standing proud while they mocked you. Clara's breath caught. No one had ever spoken of her with such words: strength, honesty, dignity. She had always thought her silence was weakness, her endurance a mark of shame. My ranch? Elias hesitated, as though searching for words rarely spoken. It needs more than workers, more than men who can rope a steer or break a horse. It needs heart. It needs someone who knows what it means to fight for family, to hold a house together when everything else falls apart. His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. My ranch needs a woman like you. For a moment, Clara was certain she had misheard him. The world seemed to tilt, her knees threatening to give way under the weight of his declaration. She stammered, "Me? Sir, I am no lady of standing. I've nothing to give but a few stitches and hard work." Elias stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "And that is more than most with silks and lace can offer. I don't seek polish or pretense. I seek truth. And I see it in you." Her heart thundered, her mind racing with disbelief. This was the Baron, the richest man for miles, the man whispered about in every tavern and church pew. Why would he want her, a poor girl mocked by nearly everyone in town? Her brothers had crept closer, wide-eyed, and even her father stirred in bed, leaning against the doorway to watch. Clara felt all their gazes upon her as Elias straightened, his tone returning to that quiet authority. "I'll not press you for an answer today. But I'll say this, Clara May. You've lived too long hearing what you're not. Let someone remind you what you are." With that, he tipped his hat, mounted his stallion, and rode off, leaving Clara standing in the dust, the heavy pail still at her side, her heart heavier still with the weight of choice. For the first time, someone of power and respect had spoken words that made her feel seen, valued not for wealth she did not have, but for the worth she had always carried quietly inside. And though she trembled at the thought, part of her heart whispered that his words might just be the beginning of a new life she had never dared to imagine. Clara May never imagined that her life would change so quickly. Within a fortnight of Elias Blackwood's unexpected visit, she found herself leaving behind the sagging cabin where she had spent her years in quiet struggle. Her father, though reluctant at first, gave his blessing with trembling hands and moist eyes. Her brothers hugged her fiercely, promising to study hard and care for him, even as they looked at her with awe as though she had stepped into some story beyond their reach. Clara promised she would return often, bringing food, supplies, and love in equal measure. When Elias sent a carriage to fetch her, the journey to his ranch felt like traveling into another world. Where her home had been surrounded by scrub and thin soil, his land stretched wide with rolling pastures, fences neat and strong, herds of cattle grazing lazily under the open sky. The ranch house itself loomed large, a grand structure of timber and stone, its windows gleaming, its roof shingled in dark slate. For Clara, who had lived in patched simplicity, it was as though she had stepped into a dream, and yet the dream came with its own shadows. From the moment she arrived, she felt the weight of eyes upon her. The ranch hands paused in their work to watch, their expressions ranging from polite curiosity to thinly veiled doubt. The house staff maids in pressed aprons, a stern cook, and a housekeeper with sharp eyes offered stiff greetings, but whispered among themselves as soon as her back was turned. They had expected, perhaps, that their baron would one day bring home a lady of refinement, a woman from the city with soft gloves and polished speech. Instead, he had chosen Clara May, the poor girl mocked in town, her dresses plain, her manners humbled out at the dinner table that first night. Clara felt the tension pressing around her like a noose. The silverware gleamed, the porcelain plates were finer than anything she had touched, and she fumbled once with the order of utensils, earning a raised eyebrow from the housekeeper. Elias, seated at the head of the table, noticed. Without a word, he shifted his fork deliberately, showing her which to use, his subtle smile offering reassurance. Still, her cheeks burned with embarrassment, and she left the table that night with her stomach knotted tighter than her hunger could overcome. But Clara was no stranger to hard places. She had survived years of mockery, labor, and want. She would not let whispers undo her now. The next morning, instead of staying hidden in her room, she rolled up her sleeves and joined the staff in their work. She helped the cook knead bread, carried water from the well alongside the maids, and even swept the great hall until the marble floors shone. At first, the staff tried to wave her off. "That's not your place, miss," but Clara only smiled. "Work is everyone's place," she replied simply, and carried on. She did not stop there. She ventured into the barns, where the ranch hands saddled horses and mended tack. Though the men exchanged skeptical glances, she offered her hands wherever needed. When one ranch hand sliced his palm on a rusty nail, Clara ran to fetch clean cloths, binding the wound with the same care she once gave her father. The man blinked at her in surprise, murmuring a gruff, "Thank you." Word spread quickly that the Baron's woman was not above work, nor afraid of dirt under her nails. Still, not everyone was convinced. Whispers followed her when she passed through the halls and at gatherings in town. The women who had once mocked her only sharpened their tongues further. They could not believe that Elias Blackwood, the most eligible man in the county, had chosen her over them. Their envy dripped like poison, their laughter sharper than ever. Clara endured, though it pierced her heart. Each time doubt threatened, she reminded herself of Elias's words, "My ranch needs a woman like you." Elias himself was a steady presence, though not always easy to read. He watched her quietly, pride flickering in his dark eyes when he saw her win the respect of his men or offer kindness where none was expected. Yet he did not shield her from struggle. He allowed her to stand on her own, to prove to the ranch and to herself that she belonged. And slowly, day by day, she did that. By the end of that first month, the ranch began to feel less like a place of trial and more like a home. The maids, once distant, sought her advice on mending. The cook began saving her a warm roll for breakfast. Even the ranch hands tipped their hats respectfully when she passed. Clara knew she had not silenced every whispered jealous tongues, would wag as long as envy lived, but she had carved a place for herself in a world that once seemed unreachable. And yet, she sensed that the greatest test was still ahead. Respect was hard won, but love in the face of the world's judgment would require both her strength and Elias's courage. The day would come when they would have to stand together, not just against whispers in the kitchen or laughter in the streets, but against a society unwilling to believe that a poor girl could ever be worthy of a baron. The sun hung low over the town that afternoon, painting the sky in deep amber and crimson, as Clara May walked down the familiar Main Street. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, the years of struggle and the hard work at the Baron's ranch having strengthened her in ways no mocking words could break. Still, whispers followed her as usual. Women in fine dresses paused mid-step, their eyes sharp with envy, and men nudged one another, casting sly glances at the girl who had risen far above the station they had assigned her. Clara ignored them. Her hands, once rough from constant labor, now held an unshakable confidence. Her eyes, steady and bright, reflected both the pride of her accomplishments and the love that had taken root quietly in her heart. Today was not a day for confrontation, she told herself, yet she knew it was coming. The town had long awaited a chance to humiliate her, to prove that a poor girl could never belong among the wealthy and respected. The gathering at the town square was meant to celebrate the harvest, a traditional occasion for merchants, ranchers, and townsfolk to mingle, exchange news, and show off their goods. But Clara sensed the tension in the air as soon as she stepped onto the cobblestones. Eyes followed her every movement, whispers carried on the breeze, and a circle of wealthy women had formed, determined to make her feel small once more. "Look at her," one hissed, her voice carrying across the square. "She thinks she belongs here, striding among us like she owns the place. She has the Baron's money," another whispered with a scornful laugh. "That does not make her anything but bold." Clara's hands clenched for a moment, her heart pounding. She could feel the sting of their words, the familiar pull of shame, yet she refused to let it claim her. She straightened her back and continued forward, head high, reminding herself of the years she had endured, of the long days of work, the nights spent worrying for her family, and the unwavering belief that one day she would be seen for who she truly was. Suddenly, a horse's hooves struck the square, a rhythm that drew every eye. Clara's heart leapt as she recognized the figure approaching, Elias Blackwood, mounted on his tall, dark stallion, his coat gleaming in the setting sun. The crowd parted instinctively, a hush falling over the square. Where fear or mockery had once filled the space, now there was only the quiet authority of the Baron. Elias dismounted, his eyes locking onto Clara's, and for a moment everything else faded. The whispers, the envy, the mocking glances, all of it became irrelevant. He strode toward her, tall and commanding, yet his gaze softened as it met hers. "Clara May," he said, his voice strong enough to carry across the square, "stand tall. You are no poor girl mocked by small minds. You are a woman of worth, and you have earned your place, not only here, but in my life," the crowd murmured, startled by the authority in his tone. The women who had laughed so freely before now exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence faltering. The men shifted awkwardly, some avoiding his gaze entirely. Elias continued, unwavering. "I chose her," he declared, gesturing toward Clara, "not for her dress, her family, or her station, but for her strength, her honesty, and her heart. My ranch, my life, and my respect are hers because she has shown the qualities no wealth can buy." Clara felt her cheeks burn, but this time with pride, not shame. The fear and doubt that had clung to her for so long melted away under the Baron's unwavering defense. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze, and saw the truth reflected there. Not pity, not charity, but genuine love and admiration. The Baron's words struck deep into the hearts of the onlookers. Those who had mocked her had no rejoinder. Their scorn faltered, replaced by grudging respect and, in some cases, humility. The whispers died down, replaced by quiet acknowledgment of the woman who had endured, persisted, and ultimately triumphed. Elias extended his hand to Clara, and she took it without hesitation. The connection was not merely physical but symbolic, a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed impossible to unite. Side by side, they faced the crowd, not with arrogance, but with the quiet certainty that comes from knowing one's worth. From that day forward, Clara May was no longer just the poor girl mocked in town. She was the woman who had turned ridicule into respect, weakness into strength, and hardship into love. With Elias at her side, she had not only found acceptance and security, but a life that celebrated who she truly was. And for the first time in her life, she felt entirely, unquestionably seen not for what she lacked, but for everything she had always carried within. The town would talk, of course, they always would. But Clara no longer cared. She had triumphed not through riches or titles, but through perseverance, dignity, and the quiet courage that had always been hers. As she stood with Elias, the sunset casting a golden glow over them both, she finally understood that true wealth lay not in silver or gold, but in love, respect, and the knowledge that one had earned a place in the world simply by being oneself.